The Pink Dress and the Call, a story of justice in the terminal. Part 1. The Encounter. The sprawling airport terminal was a symphony of controlled chaos. Rolling suitcases, hurried announcements, and the murmur of countless conversations blended into a familiar backdrop for countless travelers. It was a place where efficiency was paramount, where safety was assured, or at least, that's what everyone believed. 11-year-old Maya Johnson, a bright spark in a sea of neutral tones, stood out immediately. She wore a dress the color of bubblegum, a vibrant pink that seemed to radiate optimism in the sterile environment. Maya was excited, almost bouncing on the balls of her feet as she waited for her flight to visit her grandmother in Florida. This trip was more than just a vacation. It was a chance to reconnect with family, a cherished ritual that she looked forward to every year. As Maya approached the security checkpoint, a figure emerged from the throng of uniforms: Officer Miller. His face was etched with an expression that seemed perpetually set to suspicion. He surveyed the line with a practiced eye, his gaze lingering on Maya for a beat longer than necessary. Next, he barked, his voice devoid of warmth. Maya, undeterred, stepped forward, her pink dress swirling around her knees. She presented her boarding pass and ID with a polite smile. Officer Miller barely glanced at the documents. His focus remained fixed on Maya, his eyes narrowed slightly. "Miss, I need to see some additional identification." Maya's smile faltered. "But I gave you my ID," she said, her voice barely audible above the din of the terminal. "I need proof of guardianship." "Who are you traveling with?" His tone was clipped, bordering on accusatory. Maya's initial excitement began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of unease. "I'm traveling alone, sir. My parents, they trust me." Officer Miller's lips tightened. "Alone? At your age? That's highly irregular. Step aside, please." He gestured her towards a smaller, less conspicuous area near the security scanners. Maya's heart began to pound in her chest. She had always been taught to respect authority, to trust that adults knew what was best. But something about Officer Miller's demeanor felt wrong, unfair. She swallowed hard, fighting back the rising tide of anxiety. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "We just need to verify a few things." "It's standard procedure," he said, but his eyes betrayed a lack of sincerity. He began to ask her a series of questions, each one more probing and intrusive than the last. Where were her parents? Why were they letting her travel alone? What did her father do for a living? Maya answered as best she could, but her composure began to crumble under the weight of his scrutiny. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like she was being interrogated for a crime she hadn't committed. "Sir, I don't understand," Maya said, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you asking me all these questions? I have my ID and my boarding pass." Officer Miller's expression remained unchanged. "We have to be careful. We can't just let anyone through. There are rules for a reason." Inside, Maya was wrestling with a complex mix of emotions. Fear, confusion, and a simmering sense of indignation fought for dominance. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, yet she was being treated like a suspect. She considered simply complying, answering his questions until he was satisfied, and let her go. But something held her back. A quiet voice inside her whispered, "This isn't right. You don't deserve this." That small spark of defiance ignited a flame of determination. With trembling fingers, she reached into her backpack and pulled out her cell phone. Officer Miller's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing with that phone? You know phones aren't allowed in this area." Maya ignored him. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for, Dad. She took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Part 2. The Call. Miles away, in a high-rise office overlooking the city, David Johnson was deep in a meeting. As a high-ranking official at the Department of Homeland Security, his days were filled with critical decisions and urgent briefings. The weight of national security rested heavily on his shoulders. He listened intently as his colleagues discussed the latest intelligence reports, their voices low and serious. A tense atmosphere permeated the room. Suddenly, his phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen. It was Maya. David frowned slightly. Maya knew he was in important meetings. She usually didn't call unless it was an emergency. He excused himself from the discussion and stepped into the hallway. "Hey, sweetie." "What's up?" he asked, his voice softening. There was a pause on the other end, followed by Maya's voice, small and tight with emotion. "Dad, I need you. There's a problem at the airport." David's heart lurched. "What kind of problem? Are you okay?" "I'm okay, but this security officer is asking me all these questions. He won't let me go through. He says I need proof of guardianship." David's brow furrowed. "Proof of guardianship? You have your ID, don't you?" "Yes, but he says it's not enough. He doesn't believe me." David's years of experience in law enforcement clicked into gear. He could hear the fear in Maya's voice, the subtle trembling that betrayed her anxiety. "Tell me exactly what happened, Maya," he said, his voice calm but firm. Maya recounted the encounter with Officer Miller, her voice growing stronger with each word. As she spoke, David felt a surge of anger rising within him. He knew that security was important, but he also knew that it shouldn't come at the expense of basic human decency. He also knew, deep down, that Maya was being targeted because she was a young girl traveling alone. He'd seen the implicit biases that could sometimes seep into security protocols. "Okay, Maya," he said when she finished. "I'm going to take care of this. Stay calm. Don't say anything else to him. Just tell him that your father is on his way." He hung up the phone, his mind racing. He knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't let Maya face this situation alone. He strode back into the meeting room, his expression grim. "I have to leave," he announced, interrupting the discussion. "This is an emergency." His colleagues looked at him in surprise. "What's wrong, David?" one of them asked. "It's my daughter. She's being harassed at the airport. I need to go take care of it." Without waiting for a response, he grabbed his briefcase and hurried out of the room. He knew that his career, his reputation, might be on the line. But none of that mattered. His daughter needed him, and he wouldn't let her down. Part 3. The Confrontation. Back at the airport, Maya stood silently, clutching her phone. Officer Miller watched her with a mixture of suspicion and annoyance. "Who were you talking to?" he demanded. Maya took a deep breath. "My father," she said, her voice stronger than before. "He's on his way." Officer Miller scoffed. "Your father? And who is he exactly? The President of the United States?" Maya didn't answer. She simply stared at him, her eyes filled with a quiet defiance. Officer Miller shifted uncomfortably. He could sense that the situation was escalating. Passengers nearby were beginning to take notice, whispering among themselves. He knew he was walking a fine line. He was just trying to do his job, to keep the airport safe. But he also knew that he might have overstepped. He glanced at Maya's face, at the unwavering determination in her eyes. For the first time, he saw her not as a potential threat, but as a young girl who was simply trying to go on a trip. He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "All right, miss," he said, his voice softening. "Let's just try to clear this up. Tell me about your parents." Just then, a figure appeared at the edge of the security area. David Johnson, his face etched with concern, strode towards them with purpose. "Maya," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise of the terminal. Maya's face lit up with relief. "Dad," she cried, running towards him. David wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. He looked at her, checking for any signs of distress. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with worry. Maya nodded, burying her face in his chest. "I'm okay now," she said. "You're here." David turned his attention to Officer Miller, his gaze unwavering. "I'm David Johnson," he said, his voice low and controlled. "This is my daughter, Maya. I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding." Officer Miller visibly paled. He recognized the name immediately. David Johnson was a powerful man, someone you didn't want to cross. "Sir," he stammered, "I was just following procedure. I had to verify her identity." "Procedure?" David said, his voice rising slightly. "Is it procedure to harass an 11-year-old girl who has valid identification? Is it procedure to make her feel like she's done something wrong when she's done nothing but follow the rules?" Officer Miller didn't answer. He knew he was in trouble. "I want an explanation," David continued, his voice firm. "I want to know why my daughter was singled out. And I want to know what you're going to do to make sure this never happens again." Part 4. The Investigation. The incident at the airport quickly became a national story. News outlets picked up the story, and social media exploded with outrage and support for Maya. The Department of Homeland Security launched an internal investigation into the incident. David Johnson recused himself from any involvement, but he made it clear that he expected a thorough and impartial review. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of racial profiling and discriminatory practices within the airport security system. Internal memos and training materials showed that officers were encouraged to be more suspicious of people who looked different, who didn't fit the norm. Officer Miller was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. He claimed that he was simply following orders, that he didn't realize he was being discriminatory. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Officer Miller's actions were not an isolated incident. They were part of a larger systemic problem. The head of airport security, Sarah Chun, found herself in the hot seat. She was a career professional who had dedicated her life to protecting the country. But she also recognized that there were serious problems within her organization. "We need to do better," she told her staff. "We need to create a culture of respect and inclusivity. We need to make sure that everyone is treated fairly, regardless of their race, religion, or background." Sarah implemented a series of reforms aimed at addressing the systemic issues that had led to the incident with Maya. She revised the training materials to include more emphasis on cultural sensitivity and implicit bias. She established a civilian oversight committee to review security procedures and ensure that they were fair and equitable. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but she was determined to make a difference. She believed that security and civil rights could coexist, that it was possible to protect the country without sacrificing the values that made it great. Part 5. The Ripple Effect. Meanwhile, Maya's story continued to inspire people across the country. She became a symbol of courage and resilience, a reminder that even young people can make a difference. Schools invited her to speak about her experience. Civil rights organizations honored her for her bravery. People sent her letters of support from all over the world. Maya was overwhelmed by the attention, but she remained grounded and humble. She knew that her story was just one of many, that there were countless other people who had been unfairly targeted by the system. She decided to use her platform to advocate for change. She spoke out against racial profiling and discrimination. She called for greater accountability in law enforcement. She encouraged young people to stand up for what they believed in. "It's not always easy," she said in one of her speeches. "It takes courage to speak out against injustice. But it's worth it, because if we don't stand up for what's right, who will?" Officer Miller, after a long period of reflection and soul-searching, decided to take responsibility for his actions. He publicly apologized to Maya and her family. He volunteered to work with civil rights organizations to educate other law enforcement officers about implicit bias. He knew that he couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but he was determined to make amends. He wanted to show that it was possible to change, to learn from your mistakes, and become a better person. Part 6. The Future. Years later, the airport incident was still remembered as a turning point. The reforms that Sarah Chin implemented had made a real difference. Racial profiling had decreased significantly. Passengers felt safer and more respected. Maya Johnson grew up to become a lawyer, dedicated to fighting for justice and equality. She never forgot her experience at the airport, and it continued to motivate her throughout her career. She often thought about Officer Miller, wondering if he had truly changed. She hoped that he had found peace and redemption. One day, she received a letter from him. He thanked her for her courage and her advocacy. He told her that he had dedicated his life to fighting against discrimination. Maya smiled. She realized that even the most unlikely people can be transformed by the power of compassion and understanding. The story of Maya Johnson and Officer Miller is a reminder that change is always possible. It is a reminder that even a single act of bravery can spark a movement. And it is a reminder that the pursuit of justice is a never-ending journey, one that requires courage, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to equality.